Just one moment, and here we go.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Green. I'm the interim director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. And I would like to welcome you to the third panel at the 2021 State of the Parties Conference. The title of the conference of this panel is The State of the Parties. And we have three very interesting papers that look at some of the broader questions with regard to the party system. This panel is scheduled to last from 2 to 3:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Before I introduce our panelists and we begin with our presentations, I'd like to cover just a couple of logistical details. Members of the audience may submit questions for one or all of the panelists via the chat function on their screen. We will do questions and answers after all three presentations are completed. It's important to note that many of the papers presented on this panel, as well as other panels at the State of the Parties, have multiple authors. But for logistical reasons, we have asked just one of the authors to be the presenters for the papers. But it's important for everyone to recognize that a lot of this very fine work is collective in nature. You can find the bios of the panelists and copies of their papers posted on the conference website. And now turning to our first presenter, he is Morris Fiorina from Stanford University, and his presentation is The 2020 Elections and Beyond, an Era of Unstable Majorities Continue. Professor Fiorina, please proceed.
Thank you, John. Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've actually spent the last year and a half studying state emergency powers, totally different projects. So this is a welcome opportunity to go back and think about some of the issues I spent many years before this thinking about. And so let me begin. Everyone see that?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay. I'm seeing it.
Katerina, could you assist us, please?
Absolutely. If you just go at the bottom of the screen, I believe that's where you had your little shared content button. Just go and click that and it should pop up, and then we'll be able to share it with everybody else.
That's what I had done. Not there yet?
Unfortunately,
no, not yet.
Okay, I asked earlier if there were any disasters, and there hadn't been any yet. Oh, wait here. Yeah, the trouble is this bar keeps disappearing. If I can get it. Katerina, there's a taskbar that keeps, it flashes now and then goes away, and I can't.
Yeah, it should be, the share con button should be right by the mute button and the video button. So right on the far, for me, it's on the far right of my screen at the top, right by the leave button. There should be an arrow that says share content. And as soon as you click that.
This is what we were running into before, that I don't have that taskbar. Oh, there it is. Hang on. Okay. We're there.
There we go.
Okay.
Yep, we have it on the screen.
Okay, then I'll begin. Just yell if there's anything wrong here. Okay, some years ago I wrote a little book called Unstable Majorities. I should say, with all the holidays coming up, this would be a very thoughtful gift for all of your friends and relatives, should you be so inclined. The specific reference in the title was to the fact that we are living in the most electorally unstable period in American history, where majorities are just fleeting in election to election, beginning really in 1994 and really accelerating after 2000. Every election is basically, the institutions are up for grabs. And you can see here of 8 possible patterns of control of the presidency, House, and Senate, we had 6 of them in the years 2000, 2016, when I wrote the book. I have to cheat a little on number 3. Basically, we went from 2000 to pattern number 1 to pattern number 3 when Jim Jeffords defected from the Republican Party. The more general question that I was addressing in the book was how politics has changed so much in my lifetime. That this is from the first political science course I took as a freshman at Allegheny College in 1964. And it's the received wisdom at the time that the 2 parties overlap, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then not that many decades later, we have a totally different view of the United States, in which the parties are bitterly divided, the red states and the blue states, and you're all familiar with the narrative. Yeah, just to recapitulate the argument, assuming many of you have not read the book, the traditional literature said that first past the post electoral systems tend to produce 2 heterogeneous parties, as we had through much of our history. A 2-party competition from Downs and Black and others produces centrist politics, so both parties try to get to the center. What changed over time argued 2 things. First, the parties sorted. That I taught a freshman seminar just before COVID hit, and to tell these people, these kids, basically they're kids born 2002, and so that there used to be significant numbers of pro-choice Republicans and pro-life Democrats. Democrats who were opposed to gun control and Republicans who were in favor of gun control. Democrats who opposed strong environmental laws and Republicans who favored them. It simply doesn't fit the world they grew up in, but it's a world we saw develop. The second thing that happened, and I should say my friend Alan Abramowitz and Kyle Sanders called this ideological realignment back in the 80s. Matt Lewandowski and I call it party sorting. It's the same thing. The second thing that changed was that the parties themselves changed. Through much of our history, you were in politics from Jacksonian era to the present, to the 60s or so. You got stuff. People worked for parties because they had government jobs. They had jobs that the parties provided. Or you donated to parties because you got contracts or you got inside information on what was going to happen. And beginning with civil service and then slowly developing and getting through public sector unionization and all sorts of other changes, gradually speaking, ideologically motivated activist members became empowered, much more empowered relative to professional politicians in it for the material rewards of politics. And the result was increasing tendency to overreach. Overreach, I simply mean going beyond what your electoral mandate was. And this used to be sort of a function of having an overwhelming mandate like FDR or Lyndon Johnson. And even in those cases, they got slapped down in the next elections. Now we have people overreaching like Bill Clinton in 1994 with healthcare, not even having a majority of the vote, just a plurality. George Bush in 2004 coming into office and saying we're going to spread democracy around the world, we're going to have private social security accounts. And a whole lot of voters think, I don't really remember voting for that sort of thing. And the result is overreach is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have a situation now because of the electoral instability where the tendency is to say we need to strike while the iron is hot. We may not have another chance because we may lose the next election. Well, of course, if you then overreach, then you increase the probability you do lose the next election. So we're in this cycle of sort of trying to do what you can, thereby ensuring your defeat. Nothing has changed in the last 2 elections to make me want to revise the argument in any significant way. We got pattern number 2 in 2018 as the Democrats took over the House. And selfishly, I was sort of a little hoping the Republicans would take one of the Georgia runoff seats because that would have given us all 8 patterns in a 20-year period, which I thought would have been kind of neat, but it didn't come to pass. There's always a chance Manchin could become a Republican, but that would, again, be slightly cheating. So I thought that Trump might avoid the overreach problem. The fact is his positions in a lot of respects were not traditional Republican positions. Trade and globalization, for example, there was talk that they might go for a big infrastructure bill which would get Democratic support. But in fact, he seemed to cede the agenda to the Ryan Republicans. So they tried to repeal Obamacare. It would have probably been worse if they had managed to do it. Tax cuts, very conservative Supreme Court appointments, the wall, of course. And the result, I think, was in 2018 a reaction, overreach, although I certainly think probably the lion's share of the result would have been due to the Democratic mobilization, the frustration and the anger, the fact they lost the 2016 election. 2020, COVID came along. I expected Trump to be re-elected. The economy was okay. By spring, it was clear that COVID was going to be a major issue, and he was in trouble because of that. And so I went off and did another project. Biden, I'm thinking back on these things now. Biden is more or less a pretty good case, I think, that in the campaign, he ran as a moderate alternative to Elizabeth Sanders and to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. He ran as an experienced, pragmatic Washington type that could get things done, and he promised to behave like a responsible adult as opposed to a spoiled child as Trump had. In terms of governing, however, it's been a different pattern, I think. I think probably the American Rescue Plan wouldn't have been viewed as an overreach. Things were still dicey, and had he stopped with the BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan, I think probably that would have paid off. Where things got problematic was all the talk about having the greatest expansion of the welfare state since the 60s, if not the New Deal. It's true that some of the individual parts of it poll well. Lots of things poll well with voters until they're given information how they have to pay for them. But other poll data that I've seen, especially recently, suggests it's just not been a priority. The priorities are jobs, the economy, increasingly concerned about welfare, and so forth. And it also just plays into the party image of the Democrats as being too far to the left of the country. And there's been some of that showing up in the polls recently as well. So in 2022, I expect, as everyone else does pretty much, the House to go Republican. The only question is how much really. I thought the Democrats had a pretty good chance of holding the Senate. I'm not so sure after 2 days ago, but there's still a long way to go on that. There's an old saying that something that can't go on forever won't. And so, I mean, we're in this sort of just loop of sort of one party after another losing elections, no majorities, no consistent majorities. How do we get out of it? Well, I think realignment theory has taken a lot of shots over the years, but I still think when you look back on these episodes in American history, there are not many cases, but the thing is, somebody wins an election, wins it big, and governs in a way that they construct an enduring majority. And 1896 with the McKinley Republicans is basically the classic example, but also the New Deal. And so, could we see any ways for new majorities to be constructed? And here it's pretty discouraging, I think. The Democrats and Republicans each have one. I don't think either one works. And I'll explain why in a moment. The Democrats, the only real suggestion I've seen is the construction of a majority-minority majority, given the demographic changes in the country. The Republicans reacting to that, a populist ethno-nationalist majority. Both of these, I think, are simply at odds with the facts. And to take the Democrats first, that probably, let's say we all remember. No, we don't all remember. Back in 1969, Kenneth Phillips wrote a book, Kevin Phillips, The Emerging Republican Majority, arguing that trends such as the rise of the Sun Belt, et cetera, were going to advantage Republicans. It seemed to be, basically there was an element of truth to that. In 2002, John Judas and Reed Teixeira wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, arguing that demographic trends such as the increasing number of minorities, young people, working women, etc., were advantaging Democrats. And this was called by various names, the Rising American Electorate, the New American Majority, the Coalition of the Ascendant, and it seemed to come to fruition with the Obama coalition. There are obvious qualifications to all these kinds of demographic arguments, even though we all, I think, agree that politics
I think we may have a sound problem.
Or maybe a connection problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it might be a connection problem.
Do you think it will correct itself?
Yeah, let me troubleshoot it for 1 second. Let me see. Yeah, his connection completely disappeared. He disappeared from the meeting entirely. So he will need to rejoin.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for that to happen, let's see. Well, why don't we go on to our next presentation, and when Professor Fiorina comes back, we'll pick up where we left off. So our next paper is going to be presented by Regina Wagner, who is at the University of Alabama. And the title of her presentation is The Public versus the Activists, Party Structure and Modern American Politics. Please proceed, Professor Wagner.
All right, thank you. I will try to share the right screen here. All right. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so the paper that I'm presenting that I co-authored with Byron Schaefer at the University of Wisconsin essentially is looking at what we call intra-party warfare in the modern world. So essentially, we say there has been a war going on in American politics over the proper internal structure of political parties. Now, everyone agrees that this is sort of an important battle that's going on, an important struggle. Theorists think that it's important to democratic representation and policy responsiveness, and practitioners think that it's important for securing public office and the substance of public policy. Now, what this war looks like and what it's over exactly hasn't been the same for the entire time period. For example, for roughly 40 years early on, between 1780 and 1820, it was a battle whether between proponents and opponents of political parties in general. So should parties exist at all? And then later, for about 100 years from the late 19th century, so around 1880 until the 1970s, it was a battle between organized parties, so parties that emphasize material incentives for participants and divisible benefits from public policy, and volunteer parties, which we characterize as parties that are built on purposive incentives and policies, ostensibly realizing some indivisible public good. And then lastly, in our more modern time, started from 1970 up until now, we argue that this is a struggle over an attempt to an attempt by activists to control parties and also policies that come out of government. Now, for a long time, both political scientists and journalists assumed that this battle was essentially settled by the 1970s. So the argument was that volunteer parties had gradually but inevitably defeated and wiped out the organized parties, and they had replaced them. But then, as you all know, when political scientists started actually looking at measures around 1960, they found out that organized parties were actually still around. They were alive and well. They were no longer the larger share of state parties, but they actually at that point still represented a larger share of the American public. So that's where we went to look for sort of more recent evidence for this battle. Let's see if I can actually, yes, I can. There we go. So table 2 sort of presents the essence of this. What you can see here are 4 indicators, or what we looked at to create this are 4 indicators: appointment powers, financial regulations, voting strictures, institutional mechanics, and partisan limitations. in the states from 1950 until 2010 to create these measures of organized and volunteer parties. So the parties can be sort of sorted into either organized or volunteer, and they can change over time. So you can actually have parties start out as organized parties in one state and then become a volunteer party over time. So what we see in this table are basically two separate stories. So firstly, organized parties did actually continue to prosper well into the 1960s, as we can see here when we look at the comparison between 1952 and 1972 by organized and volunteer, the state parties and also the populations. We still have significant, especially significant populations that fall into these organized party states. There was movement that was overwhelmingly away from organized parties towards volunteer parties, but it was still, as I said, the majority of the public that lived in states that were that contained organized parties.
Excuse me, Regina, I think
Yes.
your slides are not advancing on the screen.
Okay, you cannot see table 2?
No, we're still stuck on
Okay,
your introductory one.
let's see.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
I'll just do it this way. Okay, so here's the table that I just described, where we can essentially see comparing 52 and 72, as I said, that the states that we still had a significant number of states that were organized parties, and especially that the larger share of the population still lived in these states that were governed by organized parties. So even though we had this, as I said, overwhelming movement away from organized and towards volunteer parties, they were not wiped out in the least. They were actually still very much alive well into this period. Okay, did this advance to the next slide? Not, I'll just do it again this way. Okay. So then what we did after that, we went looking for policy impact. So this is, as I admit, this is a very confusing table, so I will try to describe it briefly. Now what we did is we collected policy data, and I can go into more detail as to how we collected it and what these different policy areas are, but essentially we used ANES data and factor analysis to create these 4 policy areas, broad policy areas: national security, cultural values, civil rights, and social welfare, and then to look at the sort of policy preferences in each of these areas of party activists and party rank and file in volunteer and organized states. And I will not walk you through all of these different columns that you see here, but I do want to talk about sort of the main takeaways that we see here in the modern era. So in order to sort of get at this period and this what we describe as a war between activists and the general public, it is visible, or you can see across all of these comparisons, that organized parties do indeed favor the completion of existing programs and harvesting more benefits, and volunteer parties are searching for new issues where they can mobilize new activists. And so, as we can see here across all of these issues, organized parties are less polarized and volunteer parties are reliably more polarized, no matter which comparisons we look at. And so these are just sort of comparisons between activists, comparisons within Democrats between activists and rank and file, the same for Republicans, and then just comparing the gaps between the parties for activists and rank and file. And so we can see that these gaps are bigger always for volunteer parties than they are for organized parties, because reliably the activists are farther away from their rank and file in situations where you have volunteer parties, and then they are in situations where we have organized parties. So we see inside the political parties that these activists are reliably farther from their rank and file voters in volunteer as opposed to organized parties. But the war over the party structure has entered this new era where that characterizes the modern world, where major battles are increasingly between party activists, Democratic and Republican Party activists, and their own rank and file inside both major parties. So these newly empowered volunteer party activists had the same general goal as the organized predecessors that they had, which is to secure the nomination and to elect their favorite individuals, and also to secure public policy that were central to motivating these activists again and to participate. So this new war over party structure doesn't just pit active Democrats against active Republicans, but as we argue, it pits both activists, Democrats and Republicans against their own rank and file, and so to some extent against the public. So there is growing literature about the rising ability of these activists to control nominations by driving out candidates who aren't a part of the activist network, and to sort of seal it off to make it a mechanism that favors activists and favors activist control. I will present you a couple of examples that I think sort of underline and emphasize what we're arguing here. And each of them is offering a little bit of a different twist on this raging war that we've described between the activists and the public when it comes to both party structure as well as policy preferences. So I'll talk you through a couple of examples that we have for sort of recent battles over these nominations. Let's see. So I hope that these slides are showing up now. So this is a Republican. What I'm showing you here is the Republican presidential nomination contest, which was sort of an archetype of what we're talking about here. It provides you with almost dramatic testimony of the temporary power of these encounters.
You need to advance your slides. There we go.
I have to do it manually for each slide. I will just accept that. So here we can see the Republican contest, where we essentially the pattern that we see here was partly a result of the pre-presidential debates that were held before any actual delegates were selected, and were dedicated to activists rather than the public, because the public wasn't really tuned in as much at that point. So what we saw here before, and most of this was, as you can see, before any actual voting took place, this produced a sort of a series of bandwagon effects for different candidates, right? So we went through a spike for Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, and then Texas Governor Rick Perry, Herman Cain, former Speaker Newt Gingrich, Senator Rick Santorum. All of them spiked briefly at certain points in this essentially pre-election period, and then they disappeared. And Mitt Romney, former Governor Mitt Romney, was the alternative to each of them. And so when we finally actually got to elections, it was very quickly, it became obvious that the voting public actually favored Romney and ended up making Romney the nominee. Now, my second example, I will just do this the same way since that seems to work, is the Democrats in 2016. So if we tell the story looking at the Democrats in 2016, what we see here is essentially, again, a story of an activist war that's followed by a voter triumph in a similar but a much more focused fashion. So essentially, we have an early frontrunner on the Democratic side, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who had wide advance support in the general public, but the debates ended up being mainly useful for the activist sort of counter candidate that you saw, which was Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who was able to close the gap with Clinton because the activists came to recognize him as their candidate and sort of coalesce around Sanders as the contest went along. Then when we got to the actual delegate selection, which is usually sort of the rescue point for the general public, when they are, positioning themselves as enemies of the activists, they were actually fairly decisive early on. So I have a brief table for that. But the contest continued after that, right? And that was in part due to a second institutional arrangement that is fairly popular by activists and in volunteer parties, and that's the caucus. And caucuses have historically and across time, we've seen this again and again, very low turnout, and they have a high percentage of activists that show up. Now, Clinton ended up winning an overwhelming share of state contests of any size, But Sanders did really well and did the best among caucuses with tiny turnouts, which allowed him to actually continue after the contest had been mathematically resolved because he kept winning these contests. He kept winning, and there were these streaks where he kept winning caucuses, several caucuses in a row. And then finally, my last example that we talk about in the paper is 2020. So the 2020 Democrats combine sort of elements of both of these patterns. So we have another example of an institutional voting that favors the activists, and then a sort of intervention or rescue by the voting public that disagreed with the preferred candidates of the party's activist base. So we had a relatively stable frontrunner from the beginning in Vice President Joe Biden. And there was, again, a repeat activist champion. It was Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders again. We had sort of an activist interest boomlet in Senator Elizabeth Warren, some media interest for Kamala Harris, and then a huge number of people who never actually amounted to much. But the debates were marginally helpful for some of them. So Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar actually benefited from the debates and had sort of a little bit of an uptick after that. But they didn't end up getting a lot of traction. And when we went to the real contest, there was actually a fairly sort of obvious and significant close on Super Tuesday, the day that allocated the most delegates, making this nomination contest with the largest number of announced delegates actually one of the shortest struggles that we saw, because it was over really clearly, but it didn't look like it would be. So that's what was interesting about it, that it actually looked like it might turn out differently before Super Tuesday came around. So then to sort of sum this up, the point that we are getting at with all of this is that the state of American politics generally is widely recognized and summarized as follows. You have two mass parties that are closely balanced, and they're activists that are sharply polarized. And then we have a general public that sits in between those two closely balanced and sharply polarized parties that are more liberal than active Republicans, but more conservative than active Democrats. And so they have, because they're faced with a polarization that they see that is driven by activists within both parties, voters don't really have any trouble making a choice between the two sides, but they're never really happy with the outcome of their choice, because party activists have made it hard for them to be happy with the outcome of the choice. So voters are often driven to correct the most recent result at the earliest opportunity, which we've seen over and over in recent decades. And then lastly, and essential to this world of modern warfare, and this modern incarnation of the long war over party structure, which pits party activists against the voting electorate. When this outcome was still in doubt, supporters of volunteer parties argued that reform would spread policy influence among a broader and more diverse public and would cause more varied policy programs that turned over more rapidly within each party. But instead, what we ended up with is a sharply increased and actually more rigid partisan polarization that is catering to these ideologically more homogenous parties and their activists on both sides who are trying to institutionalize their own control over the volunteer parties. So essentially, the argument for volunteer parties was that we would sort of break it open, take it away from these party elites that were controlling these processes and open it to the public. But essentially, we just replaced the party elites that we had in organized parties with these activist elites in the volunteer parties. And what we ended up with is just sort of more sharply polarized party elites on both sides that are sort of wrestling for control against their respective rank and files. All right.
Well, Regina, thank you very much for that stimulating presentation. We're going to try to return to Morris Fiorina and allow him to complete his presentation. So let's return to Professor Fiorina, please. I think you need to unmute your microphone, Professor Fiorina.
Okay. No, I'm done. I just clicked the wrong button when I left and vanished. You know.
So there we are. We're all set to go.
So is it, I'm sorry, is it my turn?
Joseph, we'll come to you in a moment. We're still dealing with
Okay,
these technical difficulties. Katerina, can you admit Professor Fiorina?
Yes, I'm currently, he has, I think his connection is cutting in and out, so I just am admitting him and then I'm setting him as a presenter, so just one moment.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like we're back live. Professor Fiorina, can you pick up where you left off?
No, I'm done. I just clicked the wrong button before when I left. Are we really live, or is this repeating itself?
No, we're really live. What would you like to?
I'm waiting for Joseph to start here.
Well, do you have any? Would you like to conclude your? Do you have any concluding comments?
No, I just thanked everybody and said I can't see any way out of this. I hate to end on a downer, but
Okay.
I'm going to end on a downer.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I apologize to everybody for our technical difficulties. Now we turn to our third and final presentation, which is by Joseph Anthony of Oklahoma State University, and is entitled Support for Ranked Choice Voting and Partisanship of Voters, Results from a National Survey Experiment. Professor Anthony, please proceed.
Wonderful. John, you're the only person I can see, so can you hear me and see me? Is everything all right?
Yes, I can hear you,
Okay,
and I
great.
can see your slides.
Fantastic. Well, as they say, now for something completely different. I'm happy to present our paper here at the State of the Parties Conference on behalf of my esteemed co-authors, David Kimball, Jack Santucci, and Jamil Scott, who I think are all, or at least some are out there somewhere. So thanks very much for all of their work on this paper as well. So just very quickly, ranked choice voting is a system that allows voters to rank multiple candidates by preference. It depends on the municipality as to how many candidates and the election as to how many candidates voters can rank, but this is the idea behind ranked choice voting. And importantly, a majority threshold is needed for a candidate to succeed in an RCV election. So rankings ranked counting, I should say, happens until this majority threshold is met and it prevails. So some studies, the data are limited because our case studies are so far pretty limited, and the sample is pretty limited as in terms of elections that use ranked choice voting systems rather. But in the data we have, we know that some studies do show that RCV can increase the number and the range of candidates who run for office. So more candidates will run, and then perhaps more ideologically and otherwise demographically diverse candidates motivated to run for office in an RCV system compared with a first past the post system. RCV has been adopted by several US cities and at the local level, adopted statewide by Maine in 2018, and then very recently in 2020, Alaska also adopted a statewide ranked choice voting system. And as it relates to parties and partisan identification, you know, we've seen this kind of go back and forth. So many US cities have adopted RCV, but, you know, cities tend to be homogenous in terms of their political identities. They tend to be more liberal and democratic. In Maine, we saw very sharp partisan divisions across the ranked choice voting debate, where Republicans are more opposed to ranked choice voting and Democrats are more in favor. This was exacerbated in the 2018 election when Bruce Poliquin, or I'm sorry, in the 2020 election when Bruce Poliquin defeated, when Jared Golden, I'm sorry, Democratic candidate for the House, defeated longtime incumbent Bruce Poliquin. Poliquin actually prevailed in the first round of votes, and then Golden passed Poliquin in the second round of votes. So this further exacerbated the partisan divisions in Maine. Alaska, though, in the adoption of RCV, we see a more bipartisan coalition of reformers who are advocating for ranked choice voting. So the jury's still out, essentially, on how party identity predicts support, or whether or not party identity predicts support. So this leads us to our research questions. How do voters rate ranked choice voting compared with single vote methods overall? If voters hear more about ranked choice voting, which is our survey experiment, do they become more favorable? Do voter evaluations of ranked choice voting vary by respondents' race? And similarly, do evaluations vary by partisan identification? We use data from the collaborative multiracial post-election survey. We've got the data on the early release, and it's fresh. We've just gotten this data, these data maybe 6 weeks ago. We have about 15,000 responses, data points to work with. The CMPS is important because they produce large samples of Latino, Black, Asian, and white respondents, samples that may or may not be represented, accurately represented in other national survey samples. This survey was conducted April through August of 2021. It was delayed a bit by pandemic precautions and such as that. We use a within subject design for this survey experiment, meaning survey respondents are asked to do both a plurality task and a ranked choice voting task. And you know, previous studies have randomized whether voters get a plurality or an RCV task, and so we wanted to see if you know, if the same respondent, when doing both tasks, if they had, if we can measure and gauge their preferences after having done both tasks. We randomize whether or not survey respondents get a short or a long description of ranked choice voting. I'll show you that treatment in a moment. And then using a 10-point satisfaction scale, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, we ask voters to rate each voting method, the plurality and the ranked choice voting. And we show means of those, mean values of those. And then we ask them simply we ask them a series of questions, but one of those questions is, which method do you prefer? Now that you've done the plurality task, which is usually more familiar for folks, and the ranked choice voting task, which do you prefer? And then we have a series of treatments that we offer voters, which I will show you. So here first is the treatment that gives voters a short description or a long description. Again, these are randomized. The short description is a simple explanation of ranked choice voting, how the counting works. And then in the long description, we try to emphasize the fact that RCV produces a majority threshold to see if that has an impact on voter support. And by the way, we do ask voters if they prefer, if they feel that a majority threshold is important in a candidate prevailing in an election, and a majority of our respondents do say that a majority threshold is at least somewhat important, which is interesting for some of our later results, which I'll show you. So here's the second treatment, again randomized, asking you know, a simple question after voters have done the plurality and the RCV task. Now that you've used both of these systems, which way of voting do you prefer? Or a voter would get a diversity treatment, saying studies show that the ranked vote helps select more women and people of color. Now that you've used both of them, which way of voting do you prefer? And then finally, the voter confusion treatment. Studies show that the ranked vote is confusing for some people. Now that you've used both of them, which way of voting do you prefer? So here are some of our results. So overall, people by and large prefer the single vote, the traditional plurality method of voting to ranked choice voting. This is actually in keeping with many of other studies on this electoral reform. And it really, we think, relates back to something called the status quo bias. You know, people are very familiar with plurality voting. It's what's comfortable to them. And so they might be favoring plurality voting for the sake of ease and comfort and familiarity. And we also note here, though, that white respondents do rank both systems lower than other ethnic groups surveyed in our study. This is preference for the ranked choice voting method versus the single vote voting method across racial groups. By the way, these numbers represent the mean value for response, or I'm sorry, this is the percentage of, in this slide, it's the percentage of respondents who respond that they, which method they prefer. Let's see here. Oh, this is, I'm sorry, I'm getting my slides mixed up here. This is the diversity message. So whether or not the diversity message makes an impact with voters in their preference for ranked choice voting over plurality, what's interesting is that it actually does work here. So we see across all racial groups except white voters that when told that studies show that ranked choice voting can increase the diversity of the pool of candidates, we actually do see an effect across AAPI, Black, Latino voters, but not as much with not a positive effect across white voters. Okay, so this is the one I was thinking about before. So this is the treatment that measures the confusion, the voter confusion treatment, and we see here that treatment actually only reduces support across one category of voters, and that's Black voters. But other categories of voters, and we can see that the differences are relatively small here, especially compared with the diversity argument, but they are statistically significant, and so they are there. Now here's the data that are fresh off the presses for us. So you can see our regression coefficients in our models here, but I want to focus, of course, this is the state of the parties, so we'll focus here on the partisan effects and support for ranked voting. And so this is our scale is from strong Democrats to strong Republicans. And so we can see here that there is some effect among white voters as they move more in the Republican direction. There's a negative effect, you know, they become less supportive of ranked choice voting. We also observed that the hypothesized relationship that party will impact support for ranked choice voting more negatively as you become more Republican on our scale. But it's really only it really only pops for two groups, and that's white voters and AAPI voters. For Latino and Black voters, it doesn't really have the hypothesized effect. So you know, partisanship is unrelated then to support among Black and Latino groups. Okay, and I should mention here too, just to talk to some of these other coefficients, gender, sex, and registration status are actually weak and not very consistent predictors of support for ranked choice voting. And we've seen mixed results on this across other studies. So in some ways that is in keeping with our mixed results. Okay, so just to sort of summarize what we found here, and again, we're very open to your feedback. These are initial data and initial analysis, so we'd love feedback for future directions as well. But there really is this sort of firm preference for the single vote method, what we call the status quo bias among all racial groups. Latino, Black, and Asian American respondents rate RCV more favorably overall than white respondents, but still do prefer that single vote method. A longer description of RCV does not influence support, and this is one of the things I think that is the most interesting of our findings, or our non-findings so far, is that you know, while voters do indicate that having a majority threshold in an electoral system is important to them, they also don't translate that into support for ranked choice voting. So we're sort of curious about that. And that actually, we have data from the CES survey as well that also finds that there's this disconnect between the fact that people tend to want majority threshold, but don't see ranked choice voting as the system that actually delivers that, or perhaps there are other things going on with RCV that conflate that fact. The diversity argument does work. It boosts support for ranked choice voting among Latino, Black, and API respondents, but not white respondents. And then finally, partisanship is an inconsistent predictor of support for voting rules across racial groups and sort of generally. So we'll just, I think, have to see how this plays out as more localities and states adopt this reform. And then further studies have shown that sustained voter education efforts, things like voter guides, sample ballots being mailed to voters in advance of the election, actually make an enormous difference in whether or not people understand the ranked choice voting system, which also leads to their correlates with their support for the ranked choice voting system. Okay, I think that's all I have.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Anthony, for a very interesting study of a new and highly debated attempt to reform elections. We do have some questions from the audience that I'd like to pose to all of the members of the panel, but there was one question, Professor Anthony, directed towards you in your paper, and that is asking if you would speculate as to why, and maybe you can do more than speculate, but why there is such a weak partisan impact on your findings, given the high degree of partisan polarization that we have on so many issues across the country.
Well, this is purely speculative. So starting with that disclaimer, you know, there's an emergent set of scholars and a set of studies around ranked choice voting. But as I mentioned, you know, the data are still very limited because we just don't have those kinds of systems that, you know, they're not the preferred system in the United States. Now, if we were studying Australia, we would be rife with data, right? But in the United States, it just hasn't taken the same hold. I think it's a fascinating question because obviously most issues in American politics have become very polarized, and I think it might be. And I'm you know, I'm going to ask David Kimball, who I think is out there somewhere as well, to weigh in with his thoughts through text, and I'll convey those. But you know, I think it might just be a lack of familiarity. So we do have the data. You know, our one step we're planning to do. I don't know if we'll have enough data to do this, but is to pull, you know, responses from localities that actually use ranked choice voting and compare those with responses in localities that do not use ranked choice voting, to see if there's something there, if there's this sort of familiarity effect. If I were to guess right now on the spot why we don't see that sort of polarization, I would say it is sort of a lack of familiarity. We're also asking folks to use hypothetical elections. And so the candidates may or may not really resonate with people in that particular way. And I don't know, this is maybe just more of a hopeful, aspirational speculation, but maybe people see ranked choice voting as a way to sort of mitigate polarization. It can do that. Again, the data are small, but in some cases, more moderate candidates are able to make their way through the process. Because they're in a field with more extreme candidates, many times of the same party. And so maybe it's that people are sort of seeing this as a system that that can actually reduce polarization. And maybe the public, I know I'm diving into the Abramowitz debate here pretty directly, but maybe people want, you know, to feel like there's a system that produces less polarized candidates. I don't know. Again, that's more hopeful, aspirational speculation.
Well, thank you. Nice bit of speculation there. Well, we have a question that probably pertains more to Professor Fiorina and Professor Wagner's papers, but the question is about party structure. You know, and so perhaps we could begin with Professor Fiorina, and the question is, to what extent are the unstable majorities that you chronicle a product of the way parties are organized, or alternatively, is it a product of the highly polarized views that voters have? Professor Fiorina?
Good question, and it's a thorny one about what comes first, the chicken or the egg, basically. And I think most of the research out there concludes that the polarization is more of a top-down process, that party elites begin to polarize and people gradually begin to sort. And you know, I think certainly if you look at congressional roll call voting, I think the evidence suggests that. So yeah, I'd suggest that it's not basically driven by popular demand. Jim Campbell and I have gone over this for decades, basically, and he feels the opposite. But I think it's more just a question of it's like Byron and Regina account, that you have a set of activists who and I say, by the way, we don't really understand this whole party sorting process that well. I mean, there are aspects of it that, you know, you can look and you say, well, African Americans move from the South to the North, and that pushes Northern Democrats in an even more liberal direction. That in turn heightens conflict with the Southerners. Meanwhile, the Sun Belt is growing, and that provides incentives for the Republicans to appeal down there. And so you can point to something like that, but if somebody told you in 1960 abortion is going to be a really big issue, which party is going to be the pro-choice, pro-life party, you might have thought, well, the Democrats are the party of Northern Catholics and Southern Baptists, so they'll probably be the pro-life party. Or if you had said, well, who's going to be the environmental party, you might have thought, well, Republicans are the party of Teddy Roosevelt and conservation groups and so forth, Audubon Society, Sierra Club, and the Democrats are the party of the mine workers and the steel workers, and so clearly they'll be the anti. It doesn't work out that way. I mean, that these are all clearly exercises in coalition building by political entrepreneurs who put these things together. And I think it's one of the areas that we really need more study of. But and so the answer, I'd say my general answer is it probably comes more from the top down, but I think the details of that we don't understand really very well.
Well, thank you. Regina, what do you think? Is it structure or opinion, public opinion polarized?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that. It's and I think that's also what we tried to argue in our paper, that you have polarization at the activist level, so at the elite level. We obviously see some of that for voters, and especially in some primary contests. So I think caucuses, for example, are you know, very targeted towards the most polarized and the most ideological voters, right? But I would say that it's driven by party elites more than it's driven by voters.
If I could I add one thing to that?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I mean, tell the average voter, gee, your position on, if you're this way on abortion, you should be this way on taxes. And I think probably a whole lot of people say, well, why? But yet the party elites will clearly give you that's the choice you got to have. You know, and so I think it definitely just seems to be logically it comes more from the top down, from the coalitions that the elites put together, rather than by popular demand.
Thank you. Professor Anthony, do you want to make a comment on this? Structure versus opinion?
Which are driving polarization?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the chicken or the egg, the ultimate chicken or the egg. You know, turnout, I think, and political participation are a key component here. So, you know, we can have the structure that we think produces the best result, but if people don't participate in that structure or engage with that structure, then the results will still be, you know, sort of polarizing. I'm thinking about primary elections here. So primary elections were meant to be sort of the dawn of the new era and the reform era of transparency and choice, and you know, right, the median voter will prevail, but the problem is that 10 to 15% of voters participate in primary elections, and they tend to be very ideologically, you know. So I know I'm not giving a very good answer here, but I guess because I'm a little tentative to go with one camp or the other, but I do think that the structure, there are structural elements that don't encourage participation, and at the same time, because the system isn't producing candidates that people feel like they are connected to, or feel motivated to participate, it further exacerbates. So I guess as a former community organizer, I'd say we should start with looking at the system but more than just like the formal structure, and also look at things like organizations and the entities that actually incentivize and reduce the barriers to participation.
Thank you. We have a question that focuses on campaign finance, and I'd like to have the thoughts of all the panelists on this. But the question is this: do you think that the limits that are placed on the ability of political parties to raise and spend money on behalf of their candidates, are those limits contributing to the kinds of problems that we're talking about? I'd like to begin with you, Gina, because one of the fascinating things about your paper is you will actually look at these organizational structures related to parties, and raising and spending money is part of that. So the question is the ability, the limited ability of parties to raise and spend money, is that making a negative impact here?
Yeah, and I mean, we did, in fact, fundraising and ability to raise funds, and then also requirements to disclose fundraising was something that factored into the organized and volunteer measures that we created, just because it actually is, and our argument would be that you're taking something away from parties, you're taking some sort of power away from the organized party structure if you're limiting these abilities so severely, and then you are in a way you're giving an extra avenue of influence to outside activist groups, right, that can raise money, that can get people to donate, that can sort of fill in that void. So I would say, you know, I mean, we can have a debate about whether, you know, do we want parties to have greater fundraising abilities? That's a different debate, I think. But I do think that it is contributing to the structure where these sort of party structures lose one way that they can influence their candidates and can influence the structure and the process, and you're opening it up to these other groups. Now, you know, is that better or worse? That's, you know, that's a different debate. But I think it is a factor that's accurate to this, definitely.
Thank you, Professor Fiorina.
I don't really have anything to add. I've always felt the campaign finance area is just a morass. That talk about chicken and egg problems and all. I mean, it's just the one thing is clear. I mean, the financing changes, just they matter. I mean, when I started studying congressional elections, which now I think about is like 50 years ago, most congressional candidates got their contributions from in-district individual contributions. And then you just see that changing from one, then it becomes sort of PACs, then becomes parties, then becomes outside groups and dark money. And it's just sort of like, you know, Ward, it doesn't stay constant long enough to get a really good handle on the whole subject. But I really don't have anything to add.
Well, thank you. That was a very nice non-addition addition. Professor Anthony.
I also have a non-addition. I completely trust my colleagues here. Campaign finance, for the same reasons that Professor Fiorina mentioned. I have tried not to get into the mess of that, but you know, obviously money is a big problem. I don't know though. So if I understand your question though, it's sort of like, is the party organization itself an important conduit for financial contributions? And I'm not sure is the answer. I do know, we all know that there's a problem with money in politics, or many problems, and you know, I think it comes down to transparency, and that's something the party was able to really provide was transparency around funding and who is getting what, and so that has gone away. But I'm not sure if reinventing or you know, reestablishing those channels where the money goes through the party first. I just don't know. If that's
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, we have some more chicken and egg questions. One of them was really, I think, reacting to comments that several panelists made about the influence of elites on mobilizing and changing public opinion, polarizing people's positions. And so you could think of this as a sort of an alternative hypothesis. And the question is this: while elites are important, isn't it also the case that rank and file members of social and political interest groups push elites to take their favorite positions. Regina, would you like to take a shot at that one?
Yes, sure, I can try. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's definitely true, and I don't think that necessarily even conflicts with our argument that the rank and file members of interest groups push, party elites, because you could make an argument that people who are engaged enough to be active in these political interest groups are likely to be activists, yes. Right? And that's likely who they're going to be. And so the fact that they are so highly engaged, they are likely to turn out for these caucuses and primaries. They're likely to donate money to you. They're likely to get very angry at you if you don't go along with their preferred policy position. That's definitely, I think, is going to be driving that. I would just argue that those are not necessarily representative of the broad public, right? They're more representative of this broad activist population.
Professor Fiorina?
I think Regina hit the nail on the head. That the people who are active in interest groups they overlap heavily with the party people, that they're the same kinds of people. That I keep hearing people saying, I represent so-and-so, and I think, well, who elected you? I mean, it's just, we know already that the interest group leaders are not representative of their rank and file, their potential rank and file in many cases. So, I mean, we're all talking about part of the same syndrome here, I think.
Thank you. Professor Anthony, do you have a comment?
Just sort of quickly, I think it depends, and I fully agree with Regina and Morris's takeaways there. And I think they, in some ways, the activists maybe could be considered elites. In some ways, they're sort of that involved, even if they're not in a formal position. But in some of my parallel work on local party organizations in rural areas, in particular, I found several organizations, several sort of grassroots-based organizations, who were not a part of the party structure, and in fact, they all formed because they were dissatisfied with their local party organization, and so they didn't actually use the party mechanism to voice their grievances. They created a new activist-based organization to work sort of outside the party structure. And so I think these would be people who would normally be pushing their leaders and the elites to change the agenda or around their policy priorities, but instead they are deciding to opt out of the system entirely. And I'm not sure how well they're represented in that process.
Thank you. Well, we have a question about ranked choice voting. And this is a bit philosophical, but Professor Anthony, you're our expert. And the question is two parts. The second part's more inclusive, but we'll get to that in a moment. But the first question is there an assumption on the part of advocates of ranked choice voting that, in a sense, every rank is equally valid? So the idea, if I understand the question, yeah. Your first choice is just as valid as your second choice, and the presenter, the questioner, goes on to argue that first, second, third are by their nature ordinal measures, not scalar measures. So in any event, so how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, that's sort of an ongoing debate in the field, and certainly, I'm a researcher, not an advocate, at least in this role. And I would say that and I don't pretend to speak for advocates, but from what I know, I would say they would say yes, that the rankings do count equally, but it is an ongoing debate whether voters feel, if, for instance, in the main congressional race, Jared Golden is elected through the second round, right? And so people's second choices are redistributed, and then in the end, Golden picks up 50% plus one of that second round, and he prevails. So there's an ongoing question as to whether somebody's second choice, to say nothing of their third or fourth choice, does that accurately represent their preference, right? Or are they just sort of ranking something because they feel like they have to? And there's all kinds of ways to try to think about this. There's lots of drop off in ranked choice voting. Not everybody, right? Is that confusion? Is that choice? We don't know. But it's an ongoing question. I don't have a solid answer for that. I think the advocates would say, yes, the rankings count equally, but I think the jury is still out as to whether voters feel what they really feel is an accurate reflection of their preference. And we haven't quite gotten the data we need or the sample size we need to really assess.
Well, turning to
Great question.
thank you. I thought so. But turning to the second part of the question, I hate to put you on the spot, but the questioner would like to know, understanding that you are not an advocate, you are a scholar, how do you feel about ranked choice voting? And they also would like to hear from our other two panelists on that issue.
Well, I'll try and buy y'all some time. So I get questions like that from my students all the time, and I never answer because I don't want them to think that I'm biased, even though we all are in our own ways, of course. You know, I like any system, and this is punting a bit, but I like any system that encourages candidates to file and then encourages people to participate. So far, we have seen the first in ranked choice voting, again, limited, but we do see more candidates run, and you know, we see more sort of outside the traditional party candidates run. We see an ideological spectrum. I think that's only beneficial to voters, provided they can retain the information, they can, you know, they can make these sort of informed choices in a broader field. All these questions. So I like ranked choice voting. I think it's a neat system. You know, there are these sort of short-term effects. You know, people might be more confused by the system. They might be less favorable. But if Australia is any indication, and cities that like Minneapolis that have been using the system for decades, people can often overcome that confusion. They become more familiar and they become more supportive of the system. I will say that the people in those cities really like their system. They really like ranked choice voting. I haven't used it personally. So I don't know, actually. I think I like it, but if I were in a system that actually used it, would I feel some of these things that other voters are feeling? I'm not sure. But initially, I like the system. How's that? Does that give you all enough?
Very good answer. Professor Fiorina, what do you think of ranked choice voting?
I recently wrote a review essay of Lee Drutman's new book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. And I think it's probably already posted on Political Science Quarterly's website. It'll be out later this year. But Lee thinks ranked choice voting is basically the solution to all of our current problems, the toxic partisanship, etc. And I come down saying it's probably not going to hurt anything, but I really doubt that it's sort of the answer, that there may be some positives. It doesn't have all the positives that the proponents speak for it. But as I get older, I less and less think about structural or institutional solutions to problems. That you look around the world at the problems ranked choice voting is supposed to solve in the US, and you see they're everywhere. It doesn't matter, presidential, parliamentary, strong legislature, no legislature, courts, ranked choice voting, or so single, they're everywhere. So I think basically, I think there's more sociology at work here than there is, and institutions can have some impact at the edges, but anybody who just says that's the solution to our problem, or this whatever, ranked choice voting or anything else, is probably going to be disappointed in the end.
Thank you. Regina? Professor Wagner?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I don't think it's a negative. I think it's possible that voters find it confusing. You could remedy that by explaining it to them. I know there were some, when New York City used it for its primary, some voters seem to think that if they only pick one candidate, then their vote counts more than if they pick more. So these kinds of things, but I think you can remedy that but it is slightly more confusing, I think, but that's not necessarily a huge hurdle. I also wouldn't think it's going to change a lot. Like I think people feel about ranked choice voting the same way they think about, oh, we should have more parties. That will change things. But if you look at countries that have more parties, it's not that they don't have very similar problems. So I think I would agree that you know, people they see something they don't like and they hope that this one thing is going to fix it. And I don't think that's likely, but I also don't think this is going to make things worse. So,
well, thank you. We have a question about leadership. And one of our audience members was really interested in Professor Fiorina's point about overreach and wonders if the antidote to overreach isn't leadership. And the idea, the questioner goes on to explain, is if we have leaders that are willing to, really do the difficult things of, not just responding to their party's base and so forth. So, Professor Fiorina, what do you think? Can the right kind of leadership solve the problem of unstable majorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short term. I mean, if you look at, as I mentioned, that in the past when we've had crisis periods, that somebody has managed to win and to govern in a way the population approved. When McKinley's Republicans, they basically governed from '96 to the crash, the economic crash, with the exception of Woodrow Wilson, the split in the dominant party. And again, Franklin Roosevelt. So yeah, I agree. I think the problem we're facing today, as I say, is we have two, I don't know exactly how to phrase this. Yeah, like I'm not picking on the Democrats, so I think George Bush did the same thing in 2004, but you have an election, I mean, it's trying to act without a mandate, that I see Democrats say, we got elected to do this. And my thought is, no, you got elected because you weren't Donald Trump. That there wasn't really a mandate there. There was a mandate to sort of, we are sick of the kind of stuff we've been seeing in the last several years. We want sort of a normal adult-led government, and we're not looking for the biggest expansion of the welfare state since the New Deal or in the 1960s. And so it's the mistake. I mean, if you think leadership is sort of trying to good leadership is sort of sensing an opportunity and sensing the best way to take advantage of it, not sort of trying to convince the electorate of something they don't want to do. It's a bad question, a bad answer, but it's a really tough question.
Thank you. Professor Anthony, what do you think about leadership and these problems?
This actually gives me a chance to double back on my first answer on ranked choice voting and why maybe polarization is less, because I think it's sort of related. So in Maine, we see this huge divide between Democrats and Republicans, and a lot of that was elite-led, dialogue. Largely, the ballot initiative that produced ranked choice voting in Maine was largely a referendum on Governor Paul LePage, who had won previous elections with 35% the vote. And so people wanted a different system that would produce a majority winner. And a lot of that, though, how people felt about ranked choice voting in that context, a lot of that messaging did come from elite. I think maybe that's one reason we haven't seen the polarization on ranked choice voting, because people, outside of Maine, really haven't had this, had these messages consistently from elites. I mean, I think it's critical. I mean, I remember thinking sort of during, and this is sort of anecdotal, but during the first years of the Trump presidency, if we could just have an elite, somebody in the office who would respect the office, right? If we could just get back to that, if we could just get back to the point where we felt like we could disagree without hating each other, right? And I know that's been more of an ongoing thing. And I really do sort of put a lot, and this is personal, I don't know what the studies say, but I really do put a lot of stock in political leaders, especially once they're beyond the primary stage of their election, to really trying to normalize the debate. We just haven't seen that, and Professor Fiorina probably knows for how long we haven't seen that, but it feels like forever. But it also doesn't feel like that long ago that we did have a more civil tone once folks were, again, through the primary and through the general, we could get back to governing. I don't know exactly how we lost that, but I do know that there is some responsibility to be held by our leaders. I don't know how much, what percentage, and what percentage of the responsibility falls on us as citizens for electing them in the first place, but I do feel like there needs to be that change in tenor overall, in helping us figure out our relationships with each other and ensuring that our positions aren't effectively forward.
Thank you. Professor Wagner?
Yeah, so I mean, I will bring this back to my favorite topic, and I think that part of the fault, again, I would put on activists, right? So we're saying, like, why are leaders doing this? Why are they becoming more polarized? They're responding to these very loud parts of their base that's louder than the rest of the voting public, right? And so we can see this if we look at Supreme Court nominations, right? They've become extremely polarized, and that's because you have activists, very active activist groups on both sides that have made them, that are essentially threatening to punish you if you don't take the appropriate position. Now, I do think that Joe Biden could have gone a different way, and I'm actually somewhat surprised that he didn't, because he ran a primary where he said, I'm actually not the candidate of the activist base, right? And he essentially was very much opposed by a lot of Democratic activist groups who thought he was going to be, governing in the center and all these kinds of things that he said in the primary. But after he took office, he did in fact try to implement, or he still is trying to implement, policies that are, that were more associated with the activist aligned candidates, right? And that was clearly his choice. And I'm sure he has reasons for making that choice. But I was kind of surprised that that's the path he took, right? Because he was essentially the anti-activist candidate all through the primary, and he seemed to embrace that. So I think in that instance, it really does come down. I think could have made, and that's a leadership question, right? He could have made a different decision at that point, and he chose not to. So,
well, thank you. I have to say, to your point, talking to people here in Ohio, some of whom were very strong Trump supporters, some very strong Biden supporters, a real surprise on their part. These are political very activists we're talking about, very surprised that there was the degree of overreach here in the early days of the Biden administration. As one former county party chairman said to me, well, everybody has to take care of their base. But that isn't necessarily ought to be necessarily their full-time job to do that. But anyway, there was a question asked in a previous panel that I think is appropriate here. And one of the members of the audience said that while they were really enjoying the papers and they were learning a lot, they were feeling a little depressed. And the way they put it was that they had come to realize, while listening to our colleagues and probably listening to those of us here right now, that democracy is very fragile. And even American democracy, with its long history and success by any number of different measures, is very fragile. And so the question is, how fragile do you all think American democracy is in 2021? And I think this person's hoping for some good news here, but that's up to you. So, Professor Wagner, what do you think? How fragile is American democracy in 2021?
I mean, I think it's both more fragile and less fragile than we think, right? So I think that there are, we've seen that it's resilient in some ways, right? And there's no reason to believe that that's about to change. But there are challenges, right? And we've talked about, for example, polarization being one of them. If we're looking for some optimistic takes on this, I think one of the solutions is for people to participate, right? For people to actually get engaged and get involved in the political process, because they will, and that is my firm belief, you will end up with an outcome that's more reflective of your preferences if you have a broader involvement of the population, right? If you leave choosing candidates to 15% of the population, then the rest will be less happy with it, right? So I for an optimistic take, I think, to sort of strengthen both, trust in institutions and also the congruence between policy output and public opinion. I think the solution is for people to become more more involved and more engaged and not less.
Thank you, Professor Fiorina.
Well, I'll start with the bad news. That is, I am a congenital optimist. And so, so the fact that I'm pessimistic now, but no, let me get to a note of hope that I don't think American democracy is in nearly as much danger as a lot of people do today. And I've actually talked about this with some other people of my generation. A lot of the people who are really concerned today never lived through the 60s. That if you live through the 60s, just today, even the insurrection seems like pretty small potatoes. I mean, Google race riots and see how many people in the 60s, how many people were killed, and let alone how many thousands were injured. The Marines had machine gun nests on Capitol Hill steps in the Washington race riots of the 1960s. Nixon was going to cancel the election. You know, we had just the sort of like there was a period of years there when the country really did seem like it was coming apart. And you go back to the 20s, you go back to the Veterans March, you go back to the labor problems in the United States, the Battle of Blair Mountain, West Virginia. I think the miners like fought the National Guard for 3 or 4 days in a row with rifles. You know, I mean that, and the violence is endemic in America. I mean, much more serious than anything we've seen in recent decades, and we've come through it. You know, we sort of managed to get through it, and I think the idea that you can govern a large, complex society where people have vastly different views on interests and values and so forth, and not do it and do it in somehow a very peaceful, kumbaya way, it's just a pipe dream. And so, I mean, I think that this is a below average patch we're going through, and we can never see how it's going to end, as I say, but nevertheless, I'm optimistic that it will, and we will come through this.
Thank you, Professor Anthony.
Well, first, let me say how much I appreciate those words, Professor Fiorina. As somebody who has not lived through the 60s, that like really raises my hope meter quite a bit personally, so appreciate that. You know, I don't want to speculate on how fragile, and I totally defer to Professor Fiorina on that. But you know, perhaps like at least in the post-60s era, perhaps like the January 6th insurrection maybe made the public more aware of how fragile and how high the stakes are in American democracy. And I fully agree with Professor Wagner on the participation point. I think the fragility of the democracy in some ways depends on how we respond to these enormous problems. And if we give up, right, and I'm talking individually or systemically, if we just sort of give up and give in to these problems, then they will absolutely overtake us. But if we respond with ways that incentivize participation and incentivize engagement, then we will be better for it, right? The problems can make us stronger, or they can make us more fragile. The response is really key. And you know, and this is something I just feel like we have to keep tinkering with democracy. That's the way democracy works. We have to keep working at it. We have to keep fixing it. And so, you know, things like ranked choice voting, they're not a panacea. In fact, I would prefer personally to see not one single way of voting in the United States. That's not who we are, right? To have a multitude of systems that really represent what the voters want in those jurisdictions. You know, I think that's the way to keep democracy healthy. Keep innovating, tinkering, keep trying to fix these problems, and maybe not necessarily always in this federal way, in a national way, or as Professor Fiorina said, we're never always all going to agree on something. And so how do we make sure that the process of engagement is healthy, and how do we make sure that we've got people who are thinking about these problems and continuing to try to fix them in multitude of ways? So, you know, the electoral systems are a part of that. Party organizations are a part of that. And accurate representation that is a product of both of those things is a part of that. So there's really not one panacea, but we do have to keep working on it. And I think that's what sort of contributes to the health of it.
Well, thank you. I think we have a question here from a prospective PhD student, perhaps looking for a dissertation topic. And their question for each of you is, what is the area that you would like to see most like to see your colleagues do research in? in the next couple of years. Let's start with you, Professor Fiorina.
Well, I think I already mentioned it. I think one of the areas would be to figure out just how, actually I should say, I have a book at my desk called The Polarizers, which I haven't read yet. So maybe this has already been answered, but like we're talking about just how did this process of sorting at the elite level take place? And unfortunately, I think it's not the kind of thing that you can do with an experiment where you can have a neat identification strategy or a causal inference, that it's going to take qualitative work, it's going to take multi-mode studies. But I mean, if you sort of took Professor Rossiter from 1960 and plugged him into the system today, he'd be just baffled. How could this have happened, you know, in the space of 50 years, 40, 50 years? And I think understanding that would be really, how do we go from having two centrist parties that, you know, basically got along okay. Granted, they kept things off the agenda, race being, you know, you go back and look at the report on the APSA report in 1950, and they're really basically only concerned with economics, because you can compromise economics. Foreign affairs, everybody's in line with foreign affairs, both parties, and they don't mention race. And obviously sort of expanding the agenda, and by the way, that hasn't come up, but in terms of one of the things that gave rise, I think, to more polarization was simply expanding the agenda. Things that used to be local became national. And then when you really do, at one point, who cared what Mississippi was doing in Massachusetts and vice versa? Whereas when you make something a national policy, then you run into you create new conflicts. So maybe too much centralization, maybe sort of some decentralization would help alleviate some of the kind of conflicts we're in. But anyway, that was a digression, but I think it was important to mention that.
Well, thank you. Professor Anthony, what would you like to see our colleagues researching?
Well, this is a little bit selfish because this is something I'd like to research, but the more the merrier. So, you know, I think there's a sort of, and this is a desire on my part, to look at the universe of organizations and actors that are influencing the electoral landscape outside of party organizations, either in collaboration and cooperation with party organizations, or working sort of, you know, in a para-party way. And one of the specific indicators that I'm interested in looking at is candidate recruitment. So this used to be sort of the primary function of political parties at all levels, at the local level, the state level, the national level. But you know, at least in some of the research I've been doing in rural parties are not recruiting candidates. So who is, right? Who's recruiting these candidates that are running, you know, particularly at the state legislative level, and particularly in places that aren't battleground states? Are candidates self-selecting? Are there organizations that are reaching out to them? What does that process really look like outside of an organized and formal traditional party?
Professor Wagner, what would you like to see our colleagues studying?
Yeah, well, I think candidate emergence is actually really interesting and really important. So that's on my list too, of things that, and you know, there are all these new organizations that have sprung up to do candidate training and candidate recruitment, right? And I think that's highly fascinating. But in addition, I think what's also you know, what I'm really interested in, what I think is really important, is sort of both the intermediary function of parties and the representational function, right? And so sort of how well, and this goes back to this, you know, argument that I made about, you know, are we responding to activists, or are we responding to rank and file, are we responding to broader voters, right? So you know, who are these appeals for, and who's responding to them, right? And I think that's a really interesting question. And you know, we can go, and that has changed, right? And I would say part of the reason that's changed is because we've moved from those organized to the volunteer model. But you know, it would be interesting to from my perspective, to just look at that in a more sort of structured and organized and patterned fashion, right? What you know, who are the representational appeals going to, right? And which groups of voters or activists are responding to them?
Thank you. We do have a question about technology, and the question's rather long, so I'm going to have to edit it to make it so that I can read it. And what the question is really about is, in your all's opinion, what impact has communication technology had on these problems that we're discussing? And it's a pretty sophisticated question. It's partly about the internet and social media. It's partly about what's happened to news organizations, given a technological change. And it's also about, the change in jobs and income. And this person sees technology, if I could paraphrase, as a bit of an autonomous force. So, Professor Wagner, what do you think? What is modern communication technology having a big impact on these issues that we're talking about?
Yes, I think it has, and I think partly, and I think that might combine both social media and the internet, and the traditional media environments. The fact that it's become easier for partisans to sort into information environments that only give them the information that they already sort of agree with, right? That's become much easier. It's, part of it, and we saw it with talk radio and cable news, but it's compounded on the internet, right? You can spend your entire political existence in this bubble where you think everyone in the country agrees with you, when it's in fact 10%, right? But it doesn't feel like 10%. And I think that is sort of exacerbating these trends, because people, again, highly engaged, potentially activist populations think that they actually represent the broad public, because everyone that they encounter on social media does agree with them. And so why are politicians not implementing this policy that clearly everyone wants, right? I think that you do have that mechanism that's driving this, this polarization within these media environments, right? And so I think to that extent, it really is contributing to that trend, right? It's sort of accelerating it.
Thank you, Professor Anthony. The impact of technology.
It's a very easy question, no problem. No, obviously technology has changed. And I say this often to my intro students, technology is probably the thing that has changed the most, that has impacted American politics over time. There's so many factors, I think overall, it's changed both how we deliver news and how we receive news. So anyone can create news now. You can just put up a blog post and that's news, right? And then the person, receiving that information, how do you tell, especially before the green check marks on Facebook, how do you tell if that's an actual news story or not, right? It can be very, very difficult, especially when, a disinformation operative is really trying to make it look real. It can be very deceiving, right? And so this changes everything, because almost everything in politics revolves around our abilities to receive accurate information and then to align that information with our preference in public arenas. But if we don't have good information, we can't trust the information receiving. We can't pick out what information is factual or not. If we even argue over what facts are, then that dramatically changes. And all of that's related to increasing technology or proliferation of news sources. And then it fundamentally changes American politics. I talk to freshmen and sophomores all the time who don't know that they're in an algorithmic news cycle. They have no idea that they're being targeted, that the news is choosing them, that they're not choosing the news. They have no idea that YouTube is not a credible source of information, right? Or it can be, but you have to sort of really try to get an opposing point. So they don't know how active they need to be in seeking news. And I don't know that we know how to tell them that, because this is a new phenomenon. Back in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s even, we had three major news networks, three major television news networks, and we all got the information, from the same places, and there was far less discussion about whether those facts were facts than there are now. So I think it's changed everything. It's also changed, and there's so many studies on this, it changes what we look for in candidates. Since 1960 and the Kennedy-Nixon debate, now what we look for is somebody who's like a celebrity, somebody who's a Kardashian, who looks good on television, somebody who can entertain us, right? It's very different than the sorts of criteria that voters use to assess candidates.
Thank you, Professor Fiorina.
Okay, that was interesting. I'm sort of a skeptic when it comes to the importance of technology, but just in response to what Joseph just said, Notice you mentioned television. So we're not talking about social media, internet, or anything, where the television was what changed our looking for celebrity candidates. I have spent a lot of time in the last year reading these communication studies, and there's tremendous studies of social media out there by big teams of people, computer scientists, and they keep going to lower and lower levels. First they look at the New York Times, the URL level, and then they go to the story level. And basically the story is encouraging that the number of people who are engaged, who are involved in information bubbles or ideological silos is really tiny. I sometimes think the only ones are journalists, basically. And I read a fascinating Dutch study just about 2 weeks ago. The European countries get way more research support from their governments than we could ever dream of. And they did this huge panel study with thousands and thousands of people on social media. I think it was all Facebook, where to get around the chicken and egg problem, basically social media polarize people. And so they had a whole series of waves where they looked at people's changes in their polarization and the changes in the social media habits. And they concluded that there wasn't much effect either way, but to the extent there was an effect, it was polarization was driving media use rather than vice versa. That it's like, think of it this way, there's a certain set of people wake up in the morning kind of quivering and shaking, and until they go read their red meat column, get their fix, they sort of don't behave normally. So it wasn't that the columns are making them more polarized, it was the opposite. And so basically everything I see says that I think it's a problem that, unfortunately, like I say, like Regina says, probably all their staff is on Twitter, and probably all, probably all the Republican staffers and pros are on one set of media. And so again, it's just another thing that separates the elites from ordinary people who basically just pay almost no attention to any of this stuff.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful, just a wonderful panel. I want to take an opportunity to thank our panelists, not only for being with us, but for their forbearance with some of the glitches we have in technology from time to time. I also want to thank the audience and apologize for some of the difficulties we have. So unfortunately, it is my sad task to bring this interesting panel to a conclusion. Our next panel for the State of the Parties will begin at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So thank you all very much for being with us.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.